Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn Podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Hello, today we have a special treat. We've gone back into the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast and we edited an interview we did with our most prolific author, Fred Harrison, back in 2021. Fred is known as the world's most accurate economist, having accurately predicted the last two major recessions, predicting the 1991 crash in his book The Power in the Land in 1983. And then he did the same for the global financial crash of 2008-10 in his best-known work, Boom Bust, and that was in 2005. Has a new book coming out in early 2026, and in preparation for that, we're bringing his previous interviews back online. For convenience, we brought the separate interviews back into one longer recording and re-edited them for clarity. The challenge, looking at your whole body of work to do it justice, really. Before I really got into all your work, I saw you much more as an economist who specialised in Henry George and land, which I think is what most people who read your books would see you as. They see the additional stuff like the predator culture, traumatised society as an aside, which is how I saw it until I really got back into your work. Just looking at this breadth of your work, and it's just staggering.
The mistake that we've made over the last 100 years in advocating tax reform is to assume that people could see the grand vision behind the idea of rearranging government revenue to cut taxes on their earned incomes and raise revenue from what is a socially created stream of income, which is rent. Everybody who's been imbued with this idea has been entranced by the vision of an organic transformation of society, but they've left much of that unsaid. The mistake that we made, and that includes me over a period of something like 40 years, when I've gone to politicians or think tanks and advocated the need for a change in the tax regime on the grounds that that's both efficient and fair, we haven't laid out all the related issues. We've just taken it for granted that people would grasp the justice of what was being said and would understand the total transformation, the organic transformation in society that would flow. And that was a mistake because it allowed the vested interests to narrow the conversation to just the economics of it and then to dismiss it as either it doesn't work or it wouldn't raise enough revenue or let's just forget it anyway because it's too much trouble and there are other things to deal with. And we've always gone away from meetings with members of parliament wondering why they didn't grasp the full beauty of what we were advocating. At the beginning of the 21st century, it began to dawn on me that we weren't making explicit the systemic change that would arise and the human benefits of the change. The issue is not confined just to the economics. It alters the fabric of communities and the psychology of individual people. From the beginning of this century, I began to elaborate on the wider issues, working towards a more comprehensive account of what follows by the one initiative of rearranging the way government raises its revenue.
On one level, you can see it as a better way of raising taxes. And that's how I originally thought, Henry George, people being defined as a single taxer, which I think is a phrase in some of the work. And I think it was Nathan Gaffney's section of The Corruption of Economics when he's talking about people who were single taxers. And yet, as you said, it isn't that at all. It's actually just one expression of it. So before we get into the grander vision, I wonder if we'd like to go back to when you first met Anthony Werner, because he actually told me about how, I think the librarian at the School of Economics introduced you. Is that right?
I embarked on the writing the book called The Power in the Land. I was introduced to Anthony Werner. He didn't hesitate but agreed to publish it. It seemed as though it would be a commercial success. We wrestled over what to call it and came up with The Power in the Land. What I did in that book was to rescue a theory that was actually written in the 1930s by a man called Homer Hoyt. He had identified 18-year property cycles in the Chicago land market. But that got forgotten by mainstream economists. They weren't interested. At the time that I wrote the book, I didn't understand why that was so, but the Hoyt thesis just got abandoned. So when I came across it, I thought, does this notion of an 18-year periodicity apply everywhere under all conditions? Because if so, here was the tool for persuading governments that were rational could avoid the next recession because we could time it. So that's why I studied this 18-year thesis in relation to different cultures like Japan, different parts of the world like Australia, and examined UK history as well as broader US economic trends. And sure enough, the pattern of 18 years persisted in all these different cultures and geographical regions. So it was a robust proposition. The book was published in 1983, and I worked out that the timetable was such that if there was going to be another 18-year end of cycle, it would be in 1992, which it was. So the theory stood up to empirical testing. I needed to then apply a further test because at that point in the 1980s, it was in the realms of interesting theory rather than practical politics. In 1997, I approached the Blair government, which was claiming to want to chart a third way. And I explained that the evidence was such that we could time the end of that business cycle as being 2010, on the grounds that house prices would peak in 2007, they would decline in 2008, there would be a banking crisis, and a depression would follow. The Blair government had 10 years in which to study the proposition to start with, lay the foundations for educating the people of Britain on the need to begin to shift the way we approached economic behavior, the huge rewards that would arise from the change that was being proposed, and then to put in place reform that would prevent house prices peaking in a manner that would collapse into what would be a bad recession. Gordon Brown was the Chancellor, who then became the Prime Minister, did absolutely nothing, except in Parliament he would keep saying to the MPs, there will be no more booms and busts. But he took no steps to prevent the crash that occurred. I had written to Blair and Brown and Alistair Darling, who was to become the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and others in Downing Street. I published the prediction in a book called The Chaos Makers in 1997. So there is no excuse for not only the government, but academics not realizing that here was a robust theory that could guide policy reform. They took no notice. And so 2008 and the banking crisis and 10 years of austerity followed, all the way up to the present time. It was with that history of seeing politicians taking no notice of reality, the facts, that caused me to think that people like me were making a mistake. that it wasn't sufficient to go to an MP and explain the virtues of the tax reform. They had to understand what the implications were for their constituents and the fabric of their communities that they represented. And that needed a broader description of the impact of tax reform. In my later books, I did embark on sociology, behavioral psychology, and the other disciplines which illuminate the nature of our society constructed on what is a grotesque unfairness. We penalize people who work for their living and transfer a huge chunk of the national income to people who don't earn it, who don't work for it. It's called rent seeking. The political problem is that many people who work, like me, also benefit from this rent-seeking culture because we own a bit of land under our houses, which means that we can capitalize on this social injustice. For a politician, that becomes a problem. If they advocate a policy that begins to undermine the unearned capital gains that accrue to homeowners, bear in mind that something like 70% of the population in Britain own their homes and therefore benefit from this culture, there are electoral consequences. The only way to deal with that is for a national conversation that explains that actually everybody gets better off by the change. To do that, I had to embark on writing the other works that Shepheard-Walwyn published. Over those years since 1983, the books that Shepheard-Walwyn published did not make substantial profits for the publisher, but we had in Anthony Werner a man of integrity, a publisher who understood that it was a public service to publish the books that would not be popularly received, but which needed to be available to people who wanted to understand the underlying reality of how our society works. He never questioned that when I turned up with a new book, he published it, and I was very grateful to him for that commitment. It was an honourable history, publishing books that other publishers wouldn't touch just because they wouldn't be able to make substantial profits out of them. And that's what's unique about the Shepheard-Walwyn catalogue. Over the decades, they have assembled a body of works which is unique. Today, anybody who wants to begin to understand the reality of how the economy and society works can get most of the information from one catalogue, one website, which is Shepheard-Walwyn's. Well, that's phenomenal. In recent years, I've been studying the works of other authors, the distinguished professors from Harvard and Oxford, who received attention in Financial Times and other journals, looking if they had any understanding of the reality of this society that was constructed from the beginning on the basis of an injustice, and whether they understood that there was this primary need to change the financial system in favor of economic efficiency and justice. Almost no works of any of these published authors contains even a hint of the kind of change that needs to be implemented in order to get out of the trap that our society is in. And so I realized that we couldn't rely on the mainstream publishers or the media. There were honorable exceptions like Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate, yes. And occasionally the Financial Times acknowledges the need to change the tax regime in favor of raising more revenue from the rents that people generate. But these are scattered references and insufficient to persuade the policymakers that here was a topic that they needed to grapple with, while they began to explain the need for a qualitative change in the fabric of our society, one that would improve life for everybody. So the mission has to now be to help people to grapple with these fundamental issues, which are simple. Once you grasp the nettle that the distribution of income is based on an indefensible principle, which is that we all work together, and besides producing wages and profits from our capital investments, we also generate a net income. We produce a net income for a purpose, to fund the fabric of society. We are part of that fabric as human beings. We work jointly, cooperatively, to produce that extra flow of revenue that belongs to all of us through society. But that was captured historically, going back 500 years, systematically privatized and for a privileged minority. And here we are with things like inequality, mental ill health, regional gaps between the rich and the poor, embedded into the system purely because of the success of those earliest rent seekers. We're talking about the nobility who started this process, succeeding in capturing a flow of income that really belonged to all of us. We are living with the consequences. And until we eradicate that injustice, there can be no improvement in people's lives on a sustained basis.
So where I can see us go now is to get into the way society ought to be, the picture that you create in the traumatized, the very moving example you gave of John Clare and the protest poet. Everything is for one purpose, to give people, if you want this view, not only what has happened to us, the crimes that have been committed, and people not appreciating the damage that was being done to separating someone from the land that was their ancestors' home. Going back to the power in the land, how did you get to Homer Hoyt and Henry George?
I got inducted into the concept of viewing economics through the prism of a book called Progress and Poverty, purely by accident. I was in the newsroom of my Fleet Street newspaper when the news editor said, "Go and talk to this man in Victoria. He says he's got a story for us." I went to see him, and it turned out that he didn't have a story, but he said that he was a lecturer in economics at a local evening class. And I thought, well, I'd like to learn about economics. So I went along to the class, and it turned out to be the Henry George School class. And that's where, by accident, I was introduced to the notion of economics through the philosophy of Henry George, who had written back in the 19th century a book called Progress and Poverty. It was pure accident, as I think is the case with most people who stumble on this idea of viewing economics from a justice point of view. I got hooked after 2 years of evening classes, reading up on the way the economy apparently doesn't function in the way that it's supposed to, according to the conventional wisdom about the efficiencies of market economics. On my travels around the world, I was able to look at problems from a different perspective. Why do so many people live in slums around Cape Town, for example? What do the history books tell us? Why are so many people in America still dependent on food banks, the richest nation on earth? The questions kept coming, and I kept digging. I decided to formalize my education, and I left Fleet Street to go up to Oxford to do some formal studying. I spent 4 years there, and then went back to Fleet Street and my old job. But I couldn't let go of what was actually a great story, this injustice
So that was the PPE degree, was it?
I did, yeah.
And you started work as a journalist?
I started working in a local paper in Shropshire as a 16-year-old. Went to Fleet Street when I was 20, 21, whatever it was, and was delighted to be doing the job I wanted to do. But there came a point where I realized that if people were going to take this idea of economic reform seriously, it had to be presented by people who were credible. I'd left school, a secondary modern lad with no real qualifications, and why would anybody want to listen to me? So I thought, well, I'd better get some formal education, and I went to Ruskin College to start with, and that was a 2-year course for mature students who were members of the trade unions. So I did 2 years of social studies and then went to University College to study PPE. I was asked would I like to study for a degree, and I decided that it would have to be Oxford or nowhere else, and Oxford accepted me to do philosophy, politics and economics. You're a graduate of Oxford, that must be something significant.
Right, okay.
I laid that as a condition that I would continue studying if it was in Oxford, and I moved my family up to Oxford for the final 2 years, so I didn't leave them in London while I was studying up there. And so I graduated, and then I thought, well, I better get a doctorate. So I started studying for a doctorate while still at the Sunday People, which was the paper I was working for. But I then started writing this book that became The Power in the Land, and I abandoned the doctorate in favor of completing the book. The research for the book was based on cross-examining the theory which I'd stumbled on, the Homer Hoyt theory, that Chicago land market worked in 18-year cycles. And so since I discovered that Hoyt was still alive, I ought to go and see him. So I tracked him down to his retirement home in Florida and got an interview with him. I included his story in The Power in the Land. Ironically, that was a mistake I made, because in order to do The Power in the Land, I abandoned the doctorate that I had embarked on. I discovered a reason why population was a problem. And about that time, people were saying that the world's problems were due to overpopulation, too many people. Well, I didn't buy the idea, but I had to demonstrate why there were so many people who were poor. And since I couldn't accept Malthus's explanation, which is it's just the fault of the poor folk that they breed too much, I had to offer a theory as to why there were so many people in the world, and a large proportion of them were living in poverty. And I worked out the explanation, and it was mainstream Henry George type theory, and I thought, let's prove it by doing a doctorate. But I abandoned the doctorate to write The Power in the Land. The Power in the Land was important because it revealed this 18-year cycle in economic activity. For the next 30 years, I concentrated on trying to tell people about the economic virtues of tax reform. If I had completed the doctorate, I would have gone into the sociology and psychology of an unjust world and developed literature that would have been more broadly based in those early decades. Okay, so I should have finished the doctorate, but I didn't. Nonetheless, it was important for me to do the studies into predator culture to demonstrate the connections between the nation state and criminal behavior like the mafia. These needed to be brought into the arena for discussion, and Shepheard-Walwyn persisted in publishing those works, which was good. Then came the time when I thought we ought to offer the world in 1990, the Communist Party in Russia capitulated. Communism came to an end, the USSR collapsed, And I thought now is the opportunity to apply the economic theory in a society that was starting from scratch, which would hopefully be rational enough to rebase their economy on the principles of justice, which would have been easy to do in Russia because all the land and natural resources were already in the public domain. Nobody would have been upset if Boris Yeltsin, as Prime Minister, had said, we're keeping these assets in the public domain and all you do is pay the rent for them, but we won't be taxing your wages, and when you create new enterprises and sell on the world markets, we won't be taxing your profits because the revenue is coming just from the rents. This made eminent sense, except that the Western governments, the US and the UK and even Brussels, set their diplomats and professors to tell the Russian government that they ought to privatize all these assets. They had the ear of Boris Yeltsin, and he was also being pushed by people who wanted to get rich quick, which is how they came to buy the state assets at knockdown prices, and the emergence was the oligarchy. Well, after 10 years of my colleagues from around the world working in Russia for no reward except the satisfaction of participating in what could have been a historic development, a whole nation rationally basing its economy on the principles of justice, after 10 years I could see it wasn't working. This was a tragedy because a lot of people who were professionals, both academics and in the property industry, advocated the need to retain the rents of the natural resources in the public domain. They had come from all over the world to give their services free to Russia. We all converged as volunteers on Russia to help the Russian government get it right. But no, we couldn't compete with blandishments from Western governments, which just wanted the bog standard capitalist model putting.
You say in the inquest, you talk about the Russia experience, and you say how you knew the information was scientifically sound, it was endorsed in writing by 4 Nobel Prize economists. So what were the other forces that you saw came in and corrupted that process?
It was in the interests of the West not to have an alternative model emerge in Russia that would reveal the flaws in the capitalist model. What the West had to do to sustain the standard capitalist model of economics was persuade Russia to create a carbon copy. Professors that went over there, like Jeffrey Sachs, an eminent professor now with the achievements of being advisor to the UN, proposed shock therapy. Sell the public assets, create a market economy of the kind that existed in the West, and this was supposed to be the solution for post-Soviet Russia. That's what in the end happened, except that because it was all done in a rush, it created not an aristocratic class of landowners, it created a mafia, the oligarchs, who acquired these vast resources, made them hugely rich in double quick time, using methods that included murder to eliminate the competition. The result is a rogue state now, and we're paying the price with the Putin government, seeing that the only way it can sustain itself is by interfering in other countries' affairs, which is what the Russian government has been doing with the elections in the West, both in America and in Europe. So we created this creature in order to avoid something more wholesome emerging in the ashes of the Soviet Union. We had some remarkable successes in Russia in terms of people agreeing with what we were proposing. One of our partners was the most senior academician, economist, Dmitry Lvov. He headed the Russian Academy of Sciences Economics Department. We presented the evidence in the Duma, the federal government. We held seminars, we did pilot studies. We even had Sir Kenneth Jupp, a judge of the English High Court, as one of our partners in explaining to Russia the integrity of the model that we were proposing. So it wasn't that ours was a failure in terms of explaining the virtues of a certain system of property rights and income distribution. It was just that the Western governments managed to create the conditions whereby, in order to speed up the process of change, the Yeltsin government alienated the state assets by offering them at knockdown prices to a few people, many of whom were gangsters, who became eminently rich, took their money out of Russia, bought their yachts and villas in the south of France, leaving behind essentially devastation. The death rate of middle-aged, middle-class men collapsed in the 1990s. There was utter despair because there was no hope. The rush to create whatever would follow from the alienation of the state's assets in a free-for-all scramble was psychologically devastating.
That was the thing that just left me speechless. Reading the life expectancy drop in Russian people during that time, I think they lost 10 years of their life on average, which is, other than a war, just staggering.
So after 10 years, I realized that we weren't succeeding and there had to be some shortcoming in the way we were presenting our case. We needed to start looking deeper into how we explain the virtues of this reform to engage the moral sensibilities of our audiences. I started deeper research culminating in the traumatized society because I realized that when the land was enclosed, and this began in the 16th century in the UK, the impact on the people who were dispossessed was absolutely profound. So this is where I needed to study the psychology and the evolutionary consequences of people who were intimately related to their natural environments being ruptured away from those environments. What would be the consequences of such terrible deeds? And they penetrate deep into people's souls, because people are detached from the natural environment, all their communities from which they were ejected once the land was enclosed. The integration of body and soul is so intimate that there would be a pathological consequence from privatizing the commons. And once you start to view the problem in those terms and trace the evolution of British society, for instance, you begin to understand that our contemporary problems are all rooted in this original injustice. People who are dispossessed of the means of their livelihoods or who are living right at the margins of existence, they're the ones who lose 10 years of their life. Today, in Britain, up north, babies born today will die on average 10 or 12 years earlier than babies born in the rich parts of London. And that's built into their life prospects. That's not justice, that's not fair, that's not normal, but it's the way it is. But we have to explain why it's so. Why are people up north in Britain rioting in outrage at this tragedy that their babies will die on average? So I had to explain why. Why were people quiescent? Why were they accepting this? That meant looking into the way in which the collective consciousness was shaped by the original land grabbers who had to take control of people's minds and the narrative about the nature of our world in order to keep control of their stealing the social revenue, the rents that we all help to produce. So today we actually have been co-opted. We conspire in this injustice. We encourage our children to get on the property ladder. Well, that is telling them to become part of the problem. But we don't see it like that. We think it's a good idea. It makes sense. It's a rational thing to do. Get your share of the unearned capital gains that accrue to whoever owes a bit of land. Understanding how that happened historically is part of what has to become a national conversation. We need a collective catharsis. That can only happen if people actively participate in a conversation where all the information becomes available and people end up consenting to the change that needs to be introduced. This is where the Shepheard-Walwyn books are so vital, because if people need to look up the detail of that history and of the economics, that's why I'm so indebted to Shepheard-Walwyn as a publisher, because they were willing to accumulate this body of works from all over the world that concentrated on how to rectify what is the primary injustice in our society. And with those works, if a nation chose to embark on a conversation about where do we go from here, they can get the information instantly by going to the Shepheard-Walwyn website. We've had a pandemic. It's a global one. Humanity has been united by a common mortal tragedy. People are, by and large, saying, we don't really want to go back to business as usual. Okay, so where do we go from here? The professors and the newspapers all seem to agree that we should try and find a better way, that we shouldn't just think about and going back to the way things were, but they don't specify what it would take to transform future prospects. And so this opportunity, as with what happened with the 2008 financial crisis, will be wasted. 2008, banks went bankrupt. They didn't know how to rebase the system, so they imposed the costs on the population at large with austerity and hoped that would see us through that crisis. It will be the same again this time. Instead of responding to the felt need to try and create something better than what we've had in the past, politicians will end up making promises about levelling up. But they don't know how to level up. They make these wild projections about if they spend a lot of money on infrastructure in the north of England or in the rust belts of America, that somehow low-income people's standard of living will rise. All that will happen is that the land values will go up and that those values will be grabbed by a small proportion of the population. There will be no levelling up from now on under the current model of economics. The only way to chart a new course is to return to the books that sprang up as a result of the original Progress and Poverty publication by Henry George, and to trace out the detail of how people's behavior, attitudes, human sentiments would be enriched by the transition away from the present system of income distribution to one based on freeing people to work without penalizing them with taxes, but asking them to pool in the public purse the rents which you owe for the benefits that you're receiving from society and from nature, and enjoy your life. And then children, instead of being born with the knowledge that they will die 12 years earlier than they should, will now lead full lives up in Hartlepool and the other deprived regions like Blackpool, and will be on a level playing field along with children born in Chelsea and Kensington in London.
So you talk about Russia, and that also got you into the corruption of economics. The corruption of economics is very much the history of how the idea of a more equitable society represented by the Georges paradigm was expunged from the economic textbooks and economic research, and that your lived experience in Russia of seeing that happen, right, this idea was taken over by the greed is good philosophy. So I'm wondering if we got into the corruption of economics, and then we can come back to Ricardo's law, where you go into more detail about the health and societal effects, and I'm thinking that then could take us into the traumatized society and the predator culture as well. What do you think?
Yeah.
So the corruption of economics came out in 1994, is that right? And you wrote it with, what story did you want to tell when you wrote that book?
One of our most distinguished economists in America was Mason Gaffney, who died only quite recently, unfortunately, into his 90s. He devoted his life to the study of the economics of Henry George. He had an intimate awareness of the way academia had shaped people's attitudes on economics by progressively expunging the knowledge that land is significantly different from other assets. Rent is a social revenue, and that in order to base society on the principles of fairness, we needed to reform the tax regime. I wanted to collaborate with Mason Gaffney in telling a story about the history of the way economics had been skewed away from the theory of rent and land in order to protect those who were reaping the benefits of privatizing the rental income. It was vital to document that episode in order to justify the claim that there was a deliberate, intentional skewing of people's understanding of the way the world worked. This was mind manipulation. That sounds like a conspiracy theory, and people tend to be skeptical of conspiracy theories unless you can document it in fine detail, which is what Mason Gaffney was able to do. So that removed from the debate the accusation that you're throwing out these ideas of mind control with no evidence to support it. No, you want the evidence? Read The Corruption of Economics. And Gaffney has documented in fine detail the process from the end of the 19th century, where academics in places like Chicago deliberately started to play down the significance of land and rent. So, having established that level of evidence, we can now look at the statements being made today by senior academic economists and see the connection. Today, economists argue that although it's a good idea to collect some of the revenue from the rent of land, they say it's difficult to separate land value from people's wages or profits, or if they admit you can do it, they say it won't raise much revenue. So why bother? This is all designed to discourage the policymaker in government from embarking on a shift in the nature of the way they raise revenue. Because if they can't raise much, or if it's difficult to do, let's get on with some other problem. And so the connection between today and what happened more than 100 years ago is clearly defined. Well, so that was the purpose of the corruption of economics. And it led us on to the wider issues that follow naturally from the consequences of erasing from people's understanding.
If I may, Fred, could I just go back? When I'm reading your section of the book on the corruption of economics, there seems to be a change in your voice, a transition somewhere in that part of the book you read, of you becoming the social campaigner. And you offer that vision of what's possible. And I really got that sense in the corruption of economics and of just what we could create I just wondered if you felt that when you were writing that book.
After several decades of advocating the abstract theory, everybody becomes aware of the human costs of the current system and the historical origins of the crime that was committed. An example is the way in which religion was neutralized. Going back to Henry VIII, he not only grabbed the land that belonged to the monasteries, he had to neutralize religion, which was an alternative source of authority for the people. If they can invoke their spiritual sensibilities against the state's behavior, then by posing an opposition to what the crown, the king, or parliament was doing, because they can refer to an alternative authority, they could balance the might of the state with their own conviction that there is something wrong and it had to be put right. So Henry VIII neutralized that capacity that had been evolved by human beings, the spiritual sensibilities. He neutralized that independent source of authority by turning the church into the official organ of the state. He placed himself at the head of the Church of England, and now that voice that might have come from the church on behalf of the people was neutralized. And that damaged the essence of what it means to be human beings, because they couldn't now refer to their religious teachings and use the authority of the scriptures against the politicians. That was just one of the crimes against humanity. Campaigning to explain the theory of economics, one begins to realize how deeply penetrating the injustice has become. There was a point where I stopped being just an objective reporter of the facts and decided I needed to advocate. The experience of writing books like The Corruption of Economics and working in a country like Russia sensitized oneself to the grotesque injustices that exist in our society and how easy it would be to remove them just by a transitional change in the way governments raise their revenue. It's that simple. But it's not enough to describe it as a simple process, because unless people really understand the depth of the deprivation people suffer as individuals and as communities, then they're just going to think, well, he's just talking about another tax, so why bother? One outcome today is they talk about the need for a wealth tax. People earn wealth. Why are we not discriminating between wealth that's earned and wealth that's not earned? If you just tax wealth, you hit the objections produced by the experts. You can't really tax wealth because the wealthy people will just go abroad and take their money with them. And so you can't raise the tax rate on wealth too high because you don't raise much revenue for government. These are fatuous arguments based on the failure to define wealth in a way that focuses policy forensically on the correct source of wealth that needs to be taxed. In all the debates about the need to tax wealth, nobody says, but hang on, there is one form of wealth they can't take abroad. They can't take land with them. They can't hide their land in the tax haven. A wealthy person may not want to pay a public charge on the valuable land he owns. He can go and live in the south of France, but he can't take the land with him, and he can't hide the value that he's getting out of that land. So that is a form of wealth tax that they can't escape. There's no discussion of that kind because the definition of wealth is so loose that it allows the people who want to defend the status quo to wriggle and to create the smoke and mirrors that deter the politicians from making the right choices.
So there's an element there that we're not clear enough in what we're saying, or as people who want to engage in that conversation, we're not offering a clearer definition of wealth and which type of wealth you mean. But also you've written quite a lot about the way in which the predators, as you describe them, have actually changed the debate to make it impossible to discuss, for example, the way in which they've changed the word rent, or actually they've taken land out of economics, which is what the corruption of economics was all about.
Economics as an academic discipline has been prejudiced by the failure to stick with the classical economic terms, namely land, capital, labour, wages, the basic definitions which serve all purposes and lead to clarity in understanding of both how the market economy works and how good government could operate. By subordinating land into capital, which is one of the devices employed by the apologists who defended rent-seeking at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, the debate now is all about taxing capital, which is penalising people who actually work to create the capital to produce the goods that people want to exchange in the markets. Opponents of change will say governments that tax capital are depriving people of employment, which is correct. But those apologists won't allow a careful distinction between taxing land and taxing other resources, capital, infrastructure, equipment, and so on. The whole debate is a muddle, and that is an intentional outcome of those who wanted to protect the behaviour that we call free riding. Government policy now is a shambles, but nobody understands why it's a shambles. People have become distrustful of politicians, they are unhappy with policy making, but they don't know why. What is at the basis of it? They end up thinking, oh, it must just be politicians who are self-serving, who are in it for themselves. But that I've come to realise that that's just not true. Most politicians are genuinely wanting to do the right thing by their constituents. But they don't understand what would be the right thing to do, because they don't have the analytical framework in their minds that explains some policies, instead of helping their constituents, will make things worse. And that's the case today with Boris Johnson talking about levelling up the communities in the north of England. He probably believes that by spending a lot of money on infrastructure in the north, that will help the people of the north to raise living standards and the quality of their lives. But he doesn't understand why, and he's not told why that's the case. And the Treasury is full of economists who remain utterly silent. So, for instance, take the case of land. Land is unique compared with capital equipment. The technical concept is elasticity. You can tax land and there's nothing that the owner can do about it. The value won't disappear. It can't be removed to a tax haven, and therefore it is utterly exposed to public gaze and not capable of being manipulated in a way that one can do with capital that's been shaped by human beings, either equipment or in its monetary form, and hidden away from the tax authorities. But that distinction is just not part of the debate in government, and the Treasury doesn't use it to try and formulate the policies that would actually achieve the goals that the government claims it wants to realise. And there are times when people from within Whitehall will actually admit the reality, but those admissions are then shoved aside.
Going back to your friends, the Labour Party, with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, you write about the economic report that was done by the judge on the tax system. At one point, the Treasury said they neither confirm nor deny that the report exists.
It's an outrage. One of the scandals, of which there are many. We have quotations from senior civil servants in the Treasury, the tax office, who acknowledge that the most effective way to raise revenue is from the rent of land. But it's not just the rent of land, it's the rent of society as well as land. Rent is a composite value created by the contribution of the services of nature and of society and of all of us working together. There are people in the Treasury and the tax office, topmost civil servants, who understand the reality but don't stick their heads above the parapet because they know they'll get shot at. They're not allowed to talk about the reality. And so government continues to be a shambles. And the ministers who are supposed to formulate and implement policies continue to do so in pure ignorance of what they're actually doing. They don't realize that they are actually damaging their constituents' welfare because the knowledge that they need is just kept away from them.
Some of them, they see, I guess, in the best case, but a lot of them would be they see it as a victimless crime, in that it's okay for them to benefit or do what they're... So the distinction between a well-meaning minister who wants to do the right thing, wants to help their constituency, let's say in the north of England, and they've brought ideas of infrastructure projects or stuff like that, that on paper, it looks to make things better, right? So we improve transport links, which is going to reduce the cost of moving goods around or allow someone to travel between one area and another, and that then could create this northern powerhouse. But they just don't understand the fundamental economics. In one of your books, you talk about if you want to make a change, you've got to pin where the power is. In that sense, they just don't know where the power lies, in which case they can't harness that power because they've got no idea where it is. They'd be told that it's somewhere other than where it is and it's in the opposite place.
Yeah.
Then you've got someone else who, you mentioned how Tony Blair has gone from not earning very much money as a Prime Minister to having a fortune of 60 million or more in just a few years having left government, which would say that he knew exactly what he could do and what would make a difference, but he chose the approach that benefited himself and his own greed. Am I being unkind?
You're not being unkind, you're being factual, but on the other hand, in government, our culture is shaped to inhibit people from facing reality. So, take the case of Boris Johnson saying they're going to spend a lot of money on infrastructure up north to level the gap between the northern income and the average income in the south. They're going to spend money on new transport systems and so on, which will create jobs and cut costs by making it more efficient to move goods around. That is correct. It will do that. But in cutting costs, what happens then? That's where the analysis stops. But if they then say, well, no, let's think further. What happens? We cut costs of production, we increase mobility, lo and behold, house prices start to go up. And that means more people are excluded from the housing market because now, where formerly they might just have afforded to buy a house, they can't now because things are zinging along, but the net gain from all this economic activity is being soaked away by government or by the people who own the assets that attract the rent. So that goes out of the local communities and they're no better off. That is the reality that is never discussed. The dead weight of taxes, the burden imposed on people who not only pay mortgages or rents and then have to pay taxes out of their wages, is devastating. It causes the stresses, the pressures that lead people to turn to alcohol or drugs. It causes mental ill health that people can't identify the source of because it's never discussed. these pressures that Boris Johnson thinks he's a great hero by promising to spend money up north on infrastructure. He just doesn't get told, or doesn't want to know, that the consequence will be more people being enriched who already own the land, or the government will intervene with taxes to penalise the people who are now getting jobs up north. So they're no better off in the end than they were before. That's one of the aspects that lead to deceitful policies like we have in the European Union. They think that the free movement of people is a virtue and want to defend that. And they talk about it as being part of the open society, the open economy, which Britain has abandoned. But this free movement of people was just a device so that they didn't have to come to terms with the reality. The reality is that people are pushed out of the regional economies because they can't make a living there, because all of the rents are being sucked into the centre. So people lose the right to remain in their communities for reasons that nobody's talking about. They would rather have remained in southern Italy, Eastern Europe, parts of Greece or southern Spain, but they can't make a living out of it. They can't start their families there. So they move, but they are being pushed out by something that nobody sees. This is lauded as the free movement of people, as if it's a virtue, but actually it's a way to camouflage the injustice imposed on people where the rents are sucked out of their communities to enrich a few in the centre, that then creates the havoc both in the communities that have lost their children, who've grown up and moved out, and in the dense parts of Europe, London, Paris, where people congregate in slums because they're still on the lowest wages, and injustice pervades the whole system, and yet it's treated as if it's a virtue, the free movement of people.
With all this the injustice, you've talked a number of times about how the solution is really quite simple to what seems to be all these different problems in society, but actually it comes down to one fundamental problem.
Society is riven with so many problems, mental, sociological, the climate, and so on. But all of these are linked by the injustice of the way national income is divided. And the way to resolve these problems simultaneously, organically, is for people's behavior to begin to change in an organic way. That means that they authorize the reduction in the taxes that are imposed on their productive efforts, on their wages and their savings. But correspondingly, they say, we agree to pool into the public purse the rents that we're already paying, that we're willing to pay. When we negotiate a price for a location where we want to live, the price of a house, we are saying we will pay so much for that location. The only problem is we're giving the value that we're offering out of our next 25 or 30 years' labour to the wrong person. The value of the location, not the dwelling itself, belongs to the community that provides the transport systems, entertainment facilities, access to schools and hospitals. Those are the things that give the location its value, and we should be saying, as individuals, we will pay that location value, the rent, into the public purse to fund those public services. Government reduces the taxes on our wages, savings and investments, so that we end up with a balanced system where, as individuals, we are behaving responsibly. It does come down to personal responsibility, but we are funding the services that we want It's not the government that's doing this. We take control of the funding process, identify the services we want and pay for them. So we can't blame anyone else if we are not getting the services that we want. We can take the credit for funding the services that we say we need to share in common. It's that one decision to agree to rebalance the financial system, and that's at the individual personal level of saying we want to shift the revenue system off our earned income, in exchange for which we will contribute the location rents for our local business or our factory or our home. We will use those location rents, pooling them to pay for the services that we want.
And I see that. So this whole idea of like your house being an isolated structure has a value, and yet we can't value that, right? Because as anyone will tell you, when you're looking at the value of a property, it's about the location. The house can only be valued within its community and within the broader community as well of a nation or another economic region. And so in that sense, let's say you and I either were on to Henry George's idea of the savannah, but let's just say that we see a rundown area that no one wants to live in and everybody wants to leave. I can renovate a house and you renovate a house, and let's start inspiring the community to renovate their houses as well, and we'll find some way of funding that and take that forward. Right? So then things start to get better. So crime decreases, and then we find a good teacher to come in and turn around the school as well. So then the school starts to get better. So then other parents start to think, hey, Fred and John are up to something. They buy into the community. At that point, we've got houses that are still low in cost. But what you're saying is that in order to keep that community going and to keep the increase in value, instead of me getting the benefit of the property that I own, the gain goes into the community, which keeps feeding those gains, and then we can make the community nicer and nicer.
You described the origins of communities and the way they grew. As we saw in the Wild West of America, the first settlers, having relied on each other to create their communities, then decide that future incomers will pay them a price for settling. They have to pay the price of the land to the private individuals who created those communities, rather than the rents being pooled so that the communities could continue to flourish on a sustainable basis. That's the way the Wild West was tamed, by corruptly depriving newcomers, the people fleeing from Europe, and the way the land was privatized in Europe, preventing them from having a decent start in a new location. Because there was always this ransom, this rent that had to be paid to gain access, and to be paid thereafter forever to the first settlers. And
so I'm wondering now, because there's an element of me thinking, well, hang on a second, Fred. If we have created this beautiful community, then there'll also be a price to come in.
The first settlers create a community, and for that they're entitled to be rewarded, but the incomers after them also add value to the community. The first settlers were entitled to be paid for the labor input into those communities. They weren't entitled to the value of the land that was there originally before them, over which they had no exclusive right of ownership. And they never did gain private ownership over the communal assets that have to be renewed and expanded all the time by the second and third generation settlers. So the only way to create a sustainable community is to pool the rents that are continuously being created by the first settlers, the third, the fifth generation incomers, while freeing people to benefit from their individual contributions to their wages and their savings, which ought not to be taxed, so that there is this equity, this fairness about the mechanism for creating and expanding a community. That does not exist today. If we want to rehabilitate communities in the regions, it ought to be on the basis of the legacy assets that have accumulated over many generations, in fact over centuries, do not belong to the current people who occupy those far-flung communities. They belong to everybody. The newcomers that might start to go back and who ought to be going back to those settlements so as to renew them and expand them, drawing people away from the slums in the conurbations of the Midlands, London and Manchester. That model of growth ought to be based on, let's expand the shared assets of the community. We can measure the annual value of those assets. It's called rent. The more any individual adds by way of his labor and ingenuity, he doesn't get penalized, taxed for doing that. And there is a mutual benefit for everybody. Then we can start to rebuild the communities that have been gutted over the last 500 years. So the world needs to rehabilitate the old communities. Instead of creating Wild West communities in desolate, far-flung places, draw people back to the ancient communities and start to renew them. And this time we get it right by the simple formula that insofar as you add value through your labor or your savings, you keep that. You don't get penalized with a tax on them. But by using the local services and assets, including nature's, you pull that value into the common public purse. And therefore you get the right to live in the locality and enjoy what becomes a sustainable community.
And you talk there about the ancient communities. Are there any that you've experienced or seen that still exist? Where there's been a renewal of the ancient and the sacred connection?
Well, not in the West, but we can see that this model of renewal actually works and has happened. If we point to Singapore or Taiwan or Hong Kong, those communities were ancient, colonized, deprived, and then through a quirk in history, a change occurred and they started to pool the rents. And what happened in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore? They exploded, they flourished. And now a government in Britain wants to create a Singapore on Thames. We are wanting to copy those examples. But those are examples where they renewed themselves for whatever reason, and these are documented in the Shepheard-Walwyn books. They started drawing the rents and using those rents to fund public services. And that created a dynamic community. And that's an example of renewal that could happen anywhere in the world, whether it's the slums of Cape Town or on the edges of Glasgow. We can begin to create that renewal, that flourishing, by the one simple device of rebalancing the public revenue. Britain now faces two problems. One is the pandemic and what happens after that, and the other is Brexit. This is the cause for despair for many people because they can't see, there's no vision of what would create a constructive evolution out of the deadly pandemic effects and splitting ourselves off from big market in Europe. Under the current conditions, the current way of thinking about public policy, despair is reasonable because government does not have a constructive plan for sustaining growth from this exposed position that we're in, both in terms of having locked down the economy to save people's lives and then breaking off from Europe because of the dissatisfaction that so many people felt. Government doesn't have a vision of how to renew the United Kingdom in a way that raises hope and creates the jobs that can be sustained. That is why the knowledge contained in the Shepheard-Walwyn books is so vital. We can construct a plan that enables a nation like Britain to begin to rebuild itself by deciding to rebalance the financial system, to create the incentives to work and invest while liberating people from the burden of taxation. But this would also enable us to buy time, because one of the realities is we have these huge sovereign and corporate debts that have to be dealt with. It can only be dealt with on a long-term basis where there is a coherent plan to pay off the debts without creating bankruptcies and terrible national crises, while at the same time nurturing people's willingness to work and be entrepreneurial. The only way to do that is to liberate the huge value that would otherwise exist if we didn't have to pay taxes on our earned incomes. Britain underperforms every year by something like £500 billion worth of GDP because of the deadweight burden of the taxes. We can start to liberate some of that value by changing people's ability to work without the burden of taxes. Some of that additional value that's being destroyed every year would now come into play through the new incentives of not paying taxes. That new flow of extra revenue would start to be used to pay down the debts, to invest in the areas that need new infrastructure, and to inspire people with the expectation that they're working together to rebuild the United Kingdom after losing our connection with Europe and having had the terrible experience of pandemic. It can be done. It's the only logical plan that enables people to build back better by increasing productivity without doing so in the old way that is actually destructive. We expand productivity for the benefit of everybody by shutting off the sluice gates through which the net income, the rents, are being soaked away by a relative minority. That is the plan for post-Brexit and the pandemic. It's one that would increase productivity, increase hope, increase social resilience, reduce the despair that surfaces in psychological and biological ways, people resorting to the use of drugs and alcohol, and begin to renew the fabric of the United Kingdom.
One of the things we've seen since the start of the pandemic is an extraordinary rise in online retail and an acceleration in the demise of the high street. What's your assessment of how Amazon or Google could be seen as land or not?
An example of the tragedies caused by the existing tax regime is the gutting of the high streets and the enrichment of the online operators like Amazon. How did that come about? It came about because of the failure of government, purely and simply. When it became possible to create online commerce, the governments ought to have said, fine, that's an innovation which will enrich the experience of buying goods, but the online operators will pay the rents of the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum that they rely on for their business. Without access to that natural resource, they would simply not exist. The Amazon business model would be worth nothing. So there's a rental value in that natural resource, which properly belongs in the public purse. If governments had simply said, it's wonderful that we now have these digital technologies that ease life for people in so many ways, including being able to communicate with your relatives on the other side of the world through your telephone as you're walking through the park, but you pay the rental value of that resource into the public purse. If governments had done that, the transition away from total reliance on retailers in the high street would have been slow and smooth. People would have adjusted, and there would not have been the devastation of the high street retail community. They would have adapted, the time would have been there to adapt, and the online operators would not have suddenly become worth trillions of dollars or pounds. That value that it makes them mega rich is not on the basis of them being good retailers. It's on the basis that they are taking the rental value of a natural resource and privatizing it. They were allowed to get away with it, and they're still getting away with it, and there still is no discussion about the need for a rational solution to restore the health of the high streets by telling online retailers, sorry chum, but you will now start paying the rental value into the public purse. If people were obliged to contribute their share of that spectrum, the use of their phones, into the public purse, the transition would have been smooth. It would have been a beneficial development instead of a disaster. And it's not just the commercial injustices to retailers, but to people's health. Children are suffering now because they spend so much time gawking at the screens of their iPads and so on, that we are now starting to measure the ill health that this creates, the loss of ability to concentrate, to write even, to grapple with words, because it's all now done with symbols and images. Parents are neglecting their children. When they walk through the park, parents are not talking with or playing with their children. They're fixated on their telephone as they're pushing the pram. Family life has deteriorated because it's almost free. They're not paying for the use of the spectrum. If they were, they would ration the use to which they put their iPhones or using Amazon for their goods, and the high streets would still flourish. A family life would be a lot richer. At the moment, children are captive in their bedrooms, gawking at their iPads, and parents are too busy tapping on Facebook, neglecting their parental duties.
So what we just said there really, I think, encapsulates the breadth of, because on one level there's an economic exchange. It hasn't had a fair economic exchange. But what you were also talking about, and the vastness of your work, is that it's really about community and how we interact with one another, how we can make sure that Amazon and the online space pay their way, but also what ideas you have for encouraging and reinvigorating the idea of community.
So the only way to reverse this new trend that's been happening before our eyes in the last 20 years is to change the way we value the natural resource that we're using. People are paying for using their phones, not with cash, but with their data, with their lives. The commercial organizations, the IT companies that are feeding off their communities, are commercializing the information about our preferences, our tastes, and using that information to get rich. They base their advertising rates on how they can manipulate the data that they're taking from the way we use our iPhones. So we are paying, but we don't realize it. All that is required now is for government to say, the rental resource that we use depend on the radio spectrum. Individual families will have to pay that rent. If you keep children for hours on their iPads, the bills are clocking up. And Dad is going to say, hang on, you can't do that. You can spend half an hour on it in the morning and that's it. Now, the fabric of our family and our community and the larger economy begins to adjust back to something sensible. One starting point, the major one, is to say to the IT companies, these huge profits you are making, most of that is rent. We want it to pay for hospitals and schools. If you don't like it, go away. Somebody else will use the spectrum to provide an online service. So we're not worried if Amazon says they're no longer going to serve the UK. Somebody else will step in, pay the rent, and provide the service. In the meantime, we now begin to see the renewal of our high streets because people will say, well, we don't need to pay the rent of the spectrum. All we've got to do is walk up the road and buy our goods from the shops. So we rehabilitate the high streets. And it's all done by the simple device of saying, pay the rent of a natural resource into the public purse. There's no reason to discourage that use of the innovation through the internet, but you pay for it. So the more time you spend on it, the more you pay. Instead of frivolous uses, you say, well, we've got to ration it. As with everything, we ration it according to what we can afford to pay. The online communities would continue, but we wouldn't be putting the most trivial stuff on the internet. Self-satisfaction. It's a narcissistic activity to a great extent, but if people were having to pay for it out of their pocket, they'd say, oh, well, we won't bother with that.
So what you wouldn't say then is that it was effectively, because it's our community, so in that sense I'm paying for the service, but I'm also contributing the value that I'm contributing to, let's say, making my friends laugh, or maybe some of my memes or cat videos are funny. Well, what we don't get back from Facebook, and also the idea that, first of all, it is a community, because I've been productized, as you say, I am the product. I'm the one that's being sold. It's like, I think I'm interacting, but actually I'm now the product. I'm being monetized. So there isn't a way of applying the Georgist idea, the tax on that the gains go to the community. That it isn't to Zuckerberg, because he's a landowner, effectively, because he owns Facebook.com.
So it's just the standard model that rent should be the public's revenue. No one wants to discourage Zuckerberg from innovating using digital technology. He should be rewarded for that enterprise. But insofar as he relies on the natural resource, the spectrum, to communicate, that has a value. It just goes into the public purse, and everybody gains from that relationship. Nobody is inhibited from participating in online exchanges of information and so on, but you pay, and you pay a commercial value that enables you to judge whether it's really worth you spending so much time gawking at a small screen, or letting your children spend hours on end just playing with images instead of expanding their whole personality in traditional ways.
You've done the remarkable thing of calling each major crash at least a decade in advance. And that you've also written about coming into the next one, coming into 2026 and 2028. But within that, you also talk about China quite a lot. What's your assessment of how China's going to fare in the next 10 years? What do you see happening?
China is now the biggest threat and apparently unknown quantity. It is a huge weight on the global, not just economy, but society. It has a grudge against the West for what happened in the 19th century. It was maltreated in the 19th century, to be fair, but it's still living off that experience when the colonial powers intruded to exploit Chinese people. We're now in the 21st century, and they could develop their own economy, their own culture, without wanting to be malignant about it. But it is not doing it in the correct way, which means that it's becoming a force for evil instead of good. Although it retains all of the land and natural resources in public ownership, is allowing the rent of those resources to be privatized, as a consequence of which they are now experiencing a growing inequality with a few very rich people and a lot of people still struggling at the bottom.
Thank you for listening to the Shepheard-Walwyn Podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website www.𝘓𝘢𝘯𝘥.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading